Today, we're going to tackle a huge question, one that gets right to the heart of India's democracy. We're talking about the Sarkaria Commission and its landmark attempt to settle a massive power struggle. So, who's really in charge in India? Is it the central government or is it the states? I mean, this is the fundamental question, right? And believe me, it's not just some academic debate. It's a real constant tug-of-war that has shaped Indian politics for decades. And back in the 1980s, that rope was just about to snap.
So what was going on? What was this crisis that made the commission so necessary in the first place? Let's paint a picture of the time.
Yeah, by the 1980s, things were getting really tense. I'm talking boiling point. This wasn't just a simple disagreement between the central government and the states. No, there was this deep, growing sense of mistrust. You especially felt it from states that weren't run by the same party that was in power at the center. They really felt like their power, their authority, was being chipped away, bit by bit.
And this conflict? It was playing out across a few major battlegrounds. First, you had the state governors. They were supposed to be neutral, right? But more and more, they were seen as just agents of the central government. Then there was money. So much of the financial power was packed into New Delhi. And of course, there was the ultimate weapon in the center's arsenal, Article 356.
Okay, so what is Article 356? Think of it as an emergency override switch. It basically gives the central government the power to just dismiss a democratically elected state government and take direct control. They call it President's Rule. And the big complaint by the 80s was that this massive power wasn't really being used for, actual emergencies. It was being used for political games.
So, with the very fabric of the country's federal system starting to fray, the government realized it needed an umpire. It needed someone, an authoritative body, to step in, study the problem, and figure out a way forward. And that intervention, that was the Sarkaria Commission.
Now, this was no quick fix. The commission was officially set up in 1983, and they took a full 5 years to do their homework. I mean, this was a deep, methodical investigation that ended with this huge 1,600-page report in 1988. And just 2 years after that, in 1990, we saw one of its biggest recommendations actually come to life.
And look at the team they put together. This wasn't just a bunch of lawyers or politicians. They had Justice R.S. Sarkaria, a retired Supreme Court judge, bringing that crucial legal perspective. They had Shri B. Sivarama, a former cabinet secretary. This guy knew the ins and outs of administration like nobody else. And they had Dr. S.R. Sen, an economist. So, you see, by bringing together a top judge, a master of bureaucracy, and an economic expert, they made sure they were looking at this problem from every single angle.
247. Just let that number sink in. That's how many specific recommendations the commission made in its final report. So this wasn't some vague list of ideas, oh no. This was a detailed 1,600-page blueprint for how to fix things.
So, what did these 24/7 recommendations actually say? Well, you can think of them as a whole new rulebook for how the center and the state should get along. It was a vision for what the commission itself called cooperative federalism.
And remember Article 356, the President's Rule? The commission came down hard on how it was being misused. Their own words are so powerful here. They said it should be used very sparingly, in extreme cases only, as a measure of last resort. I mean, the message is crystal clear. This is a nuclear option, not a tool you pull out for every little disagreement. It's for when everything else has already failed.
And what about those politicized governors? Well, the commission laid out a really clear set of rules to fix that. The governor, they said, has to be a prominent person from outside the state. They shouldn't have been active in politics recently. And get this, the state chief minister must be consulted before they're appointed. The whole point was to transform the governor from a political player into a detached, impartial umpire, loyal only to the Constitution, not to whichever party was in power in Delhi.
This was maybe their single biggest institutional idea. They said, look, instead of the center and states arguing through the media or behind closed doors, why not create a permanent table? A place where the prime minister and all the chief ministers can actually sit down together and hash things out. A formal, permanent body for cooperation. It just makes sense, right? Okay, so we have this brilliant, massive report with 247 recommendations. It gets submitted. But here's the billion-dollar question. What actually happened? Did anything really change? Let's take a look at the report card.
So, at first glance, this looks pretty good, right? A major victory even. 72.5% of the recommendations were either implemented or accepted. And that sounds amazing. But that other 27.5%? Well, that's where the story gets a little more complicated.
Because, the numbers don't really tell the whole story.
The thing is, many of the most important recommendations, especially the ones that would have really put a check on the center's power, they were either watered down over time or just never really acted on. So acceptance on paper didn't always mean real change on the ground.
And this quote, I think, really gets to the heart of how the Commission saw its own job. They weren't trying to be revolutionaries. They actually believed that a strong central government was essential for India's unity. Their goal wasn't a radical teardown of the system, it was to create a functional arrangement for cooperative action. In other words, make the existing system work better, not blow it up and start over. So, a report from the 1980s. Why are we still talking about it today? Well, because the fundamental questions the Sarkaria Commission was wrestling with are the very same questions that are still shaping Indian politics right now. And to really get why the Commission's moderate approach was so important, it helps to look at what came before it. You had the Rajamanar Committee back in 1969, for instance, which was way more radical. They wanted to basically abolish Article 356 and shift a ton of power to the states. The Sarkaria Commission, on the other hand, charted a middle path. They said, let's strengthen the states, but let's also preserve a strong center. And that pragmatism is a huge reason why its influence has lasted. And make no mistake, its legacy is profound. Those principles they laid out for Article 356, they were eventually upheld by India's Supreme Court in a landmark case. The Interstate Council, their big idea, it's still around today. And that core vision of cooperative federalism, that's the exact language that policymakers and modern bodies like Niti Aayog use all the time. Which brings us all the way back to that first big question. What the Sarkaria Commission really shows us is that this whole federal tug-of-war, it was never really solved. The Commission just wrote a better, more modern rulebook for the contest. It's a powerful reminder that the balance of power in India isn't some finished product set in stone. It's a negotiation. It's a perpetual work in progress.